everyone. My name is Marta Wojciechowska and welcome on this book launch organized by Specialist Group for Deliberative and Participatory Democracy of Podcasters Association UK. So the book we are very, very happy to meet and very happy to launch is titled Radical Proceduralism, Democracy from Philosophical Principles to Political Institutions by Dannica Fleuß and is published by Emerald Publishing. So I'm going to introduce first the speakers, who's going to be the author, and two kind of not really critics, but commentators. So first we are going to have a very short, around 15 minutes, 18 minutes presentation by Dannica, who's currently a postdoctoral researcher at Helmut Schmidt University and also co-convener of this precise specialist group. Dannica is a deliberative Democrat. Her work is very, very, I would say overarching the whole development with the field, because I'm always very much impressed how Dannica combines very strong normative principles with a bit more empirical applied work. Her work appeared in podcast studies, political geography, policy and intent, and many, many other outputs. So I'm sure it will be very exciting read in terms of the book. She's going to be in conversation with Professor John Parkinson from Maastricht University. John is Professor of Social and Political Philosophy. And for those of you who don't know, I think everybody knows, John is one of the literally the fathers, the pillars and foundations of the systemic of deliberative systems approach. He published several books, including Deliberating Real Words, the deliberative system, mapping and measuring deliberation, and currently works on kind of mixed method, combined sort of research on electronic means and assessment of the democratic contribution to the public sphere. Last, but certainly not least, and actually person who will be first providing the comments will be Dr. Sonia Bussu, who's Senior Lecturer in Politics and Public Administration at Manchester Metropolitan University. Sonia's work is also very, very overarching in terms of the field. Sonia has many years of fantastic experience with real-life policy work, but after that, she came back to university to draw on those real-life experiences. Sonia's work very much contributes to sort of participatory systems thinking, including also deliberation and also participatory methods. So she probably will be providing a bit more practical focus for the book and for the comments. Sonia is also a co-convener of this very precise specialist group. So without further ado, I'm going to let Dannica start. Dannica, before you start, I just wanted to actually mention again, please do have a look out for the discount code for the book, which I'll post into the chat room during the talk. The book is definitely available and to be purchased, and I very much recommend it. If you have any questions after the comments from two of the commentators, I will be leading the Q&A. So please do pop the questions already there if you have any questions and any comments. Dannica, the floor is yours.
Dannica, you're muted.
Okay, so I'm going to start again. That was maybe being overwhelmed by several tasks as well at once. Okay, so
okay.
All right. First of all, thank you very much. Thanks very much to all of you for being here. Thanks to Marta, John, and Sonia for organizing, moderating, and discussing with me during this launch of my freshly published book, Radical Proceduralism, Democracy from Philosophical Principles to Political Institutions. Just as many or possibly all books about democracy and democratic theory that have been published in the past years, my point of departure are recent diagnoses that contemporary democracies are in great peril. By now, there has been a vast array of responses to this diagnosis, and they have been complemented by reform proposals that we suggest that we need either more or less democracy, more or less citizen participation, And what has been particularly prominent in many public and scholarly discourses over the past years were expertocratic models of democratic governance that aim at strengthening the role of experts in policymaking to compensate for citizen disaffection and disinterest vis-à-vis politics, and to outbalance what is taken to be citizen incompetence. In this book, I oppose these expertocratic reform proposals, but in the first instance, I suggest to take a step back from all these deficit diagnoses to ask the following quite basic questions. First, what are the conditions of democracy's political legitimacy after all? And secondly, what institutional devices are suitable for putting these principles into practice? Yet, before I address these big questions and make bold claims about how to renew and reform democracy, I want to use an example from everyday collective decision-making that I also refer to in the introduction of my book to pump your intuitions about democratic legitimacy and collective decision-making a bit. So let's start with the little things and consider how we make collective decisions in our everyday lives. Before the world was hit by a pandemic, it feels a bit like this was ages ago, I met a group of 8 people to go to the movies. We hadn't agreed on a specific movie in advance, but had casually articulated our preferences for seeing one of the sci-fi movies that had just come out. Now, it happens to be the case, and everybody who knows me knows that I am very well informed about sci-fi movies and TV series, at least as long as they involve either space or time travel. And I fancy myself as somewhat of an expert in these matters. However, the problem was this. There were 2 sci-fi movies on the movie program, one from an excellent film series with a beautiful storyline and located in a complex cosmos of interstellar political relations, and one from a series that builds on noisy effects rather than the intricacies of time travel. And although our little group had envisaged watching a sci-fi movie that night, there was no agreement at all concerning which one to watch. Members of our group held different interests and preferences and displayed remarkably different attitudes towards features that matter in selecting sci-fi movies in the first place. So I not only consider myself an expert in sci-fi, I also conceive of myself as a democrat who does not impose her interests or preferences on others. And this presented me with a serious dilemma. On the one hand, I reject any form of paternalistic or authoritarian decision-making. And on the other hand, I was really not willing to let people who cannot tell a TARDIS from a tricorder decide what movie to watch. So in a nutshell, I felt that there was a right answer to the question, what movie should we see tonight? And what is more, I felt that I would be perfectly able to choose the best, most aesthetically pleasing, politically inspiring, and entertaining movie. All people involved in this group were social scientists or philosophers. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. Anyways, we all conceived of ourselves as democrats in every fiber of our being. And in consequence, we had a rather long debate about the right course of actions, the standards that should be applied in selecting movies, and our respective interests and visions of how to have a relaxed evening. And we finally resolved this conflict by watching neither of the sci-fi movies, but a romantic comedy. So in a nutshell, at least from my viewpoint, inclusive democratic deliberation led to the worst conceivable result. So I was definitely not happy about this outcome. I felt that it was all valid quality standards for evening plans or movies considered a very, very bad result. But did I consider the collective decision in favor of watching the romantic comedy to be illegitimate? At this point, I must admit that I was and still am torn. Arguably, some variables other than my disputable expert status in these matters were relevant to the depicted situation. We wanted to make a decision and jointly watch a movie at some point. We also wanted to remain friends and therefore excluded blackmailing and other uses of physical and non-physical violence from our action portfolio. We had different preferences and competing interests. and there was no quick and easy solution, no straightforward right method to resolve our disagreement. So our evening planning dispute was, in short, characterized by what Jeremy Waldron famously termed the circumstances of politics. It was a situation of deep and perennial disagreements in which the actors involved nevertheless wanted and needed to act in concert. And I'm claiming in the book that in the circumstances that characterize contemporary pluralistic societies, what should be done is always subject to perennial political and philosophical disagreements. So political issues such as the choice of presidential candidates, abortion legislation, the regulation of free speech, or the justice of certain welfare provision, you name it, are always issues that we can expect reasonably well-informed people to disagree upon, and to disagree upon in good faith. In short, there are no political truths, either with regards to particular policy decisions or to institutional design proposals. And I'm claiming that democratic politics and democratic theory must take this pluralism and disagreement seriously, and that imposing standards of truth or correctness comes with a paternalistic threat. With a view to the spectrum of alternative understandings of democratic legitimacy, we can now see that to avoid paternalism, we must avoid understandings of democratic legitimacy that presuppose any standards of truth or correctness or rightness. And this singles out a radical proceduralist conception, which is defined as the understanding of democratic legitimacy that defines political decisions, laws, or also constitutional provisions as legitimate if and only if they have been brought about by a fair and inclusive procedure. To sum up these considerations, I'm starting out from fairly simple normative convictions. We must avoid paternalism at all costs, which means that we must base all collectively binding rules solely on inclusive democratic procedures, avoid all references to truth or correctness standards, but, and this is the crucial dilemma that I'm dealing with in this book, still develop an action guiding vision for what should be done, for how politics shall be conducted, and for what democratic institutions should look like or can look like to be legitimate. The book then follows an exemplary path of reasoning that leads from meta-theoretic considerations in the first chapter to philosophical debates about the principles of democratic legitimacy, and ends up with discussing concrete institutional devices. So I'm obviously not the first one to aim at a proceduralist account of democratic legitimacy, and I'm well aware of that. And so one main building block of the book is the discussion of two giants in this field, so of John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas in chapter 3 and 4. And I'm discussing their approaches in detail. And here in these discussions, we're usually confronted with two claims. The first claim is that Habermas and Rawls have not been able to propose a radical proceduralist vision of democratic politics or legitimacy, and I agree with this judgment. The second claim is that Habermas has taken proceduralism as far as it can go. And here my response is no, we can do better as radical proceduralists. And it is possible to propose a radical proceduralist notion of democratic politics. The main problem that I'm identifying in the accounts of John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas, very briefly put, is that they presuppose metaphysically laden assumptions about reasonableness. So both Rawls and Habermas refer to substantive notions of what it means to be a reasonable citizen, and consider reasonableness to be incorporated in liberal democratic institutions or constitutions. And consequently, they more or less explicitly refer to standards of rightness, truth, or correctness. And in my own discursive account of radical proceduralist ideas and institutions, I aim at avoiding such notions because I consider them to be potentially exclusive and paternalistic. So I aim at avoiding these metaphysically laden assumptions about reasonableness, reasonable citizens, and reasonable institutions. So radical proceduralism, and now I'm zooming into my own account in chapter 5, takes the discourse principle, a discursive notion of legitimacy as a basic point of departure, but aims at avoiding the pitfalls that I identified in Habermas's account. And I'm conceptualizing openness and open-endedness in this approach as a positive ideal for democratic politics. And more specifically, I'm arguing that democratic politics shall realize inclusive participation among all affected members of a community, facilitate participants' reflectiveness and their openness towards diverse viewpoints, their open-mindedness towards diverse viewpoints and perspectives, as well as their awareness about how and why they and others form their political judgments and preferences. And lastly, I'm arguing that the boundary conditions, the rules of the democratic game, as well as more specific polities, must always be subject to open-ended debates and contestations. What we can see in discussing these ideals, however, is if we avoid presupposing substantive notions of reasonableness or rightness at this point, and if we want to avoid, or if I want to avoid the pitfalls that I identified in Habermas's account, that I'm ascribing to Habermas's account, then these ideals, these are fairly abstract ideas, have limited implications for concrete political legal norms and institutions. So if we don't want to overstep these limits of abstract theorizing, and that's a main claim here, we must admit that proceduralism goes all the way down, that even basic democratic principles and values shall be subject to open-ended contestation. This, however, nevertheless gives us, so I will argue, some negative critical standard for assessing existing institutions and reform proposals, even if the decision about how exactly democracy should work is ultimately not up to philosophers or theorists. So radical proceduralists must admit that proposing concrete institutions for political communities is beyond the remits of theory and political philosophy. If armchair theorizing or armchair political philosophy was the only option at this point, the critics of proceduralists' account would indeed be right. There would be no way to say anything substantive about what democratic politics should look like. There would be no way to bring substance back in and to outline action guiding recommendations for democratic politics. In short, the radical proceduralism would be of no use to our world, as Rawls put it himself. Consequently, I'm proposing a methodological turn and ask the following question. What's an alternative methodological approach, or more pointedly put, how can we get out of the theorist's armchair? In a nutshell, my response to this is don't ask philosophers, ask citizens. So radical proceduralists must democratize theorizing about democracy. They must engage citizens in the very project of normative theorizing and developing institutional design proposals. And in the book, I'm drawing from past and ongoing institutional experimentation and civil society-led reform initiatives for institutional and constitutional reform, particularly in Germany and Iceland, where I also conducted some interviews with the representatives of these organizations. Based on engaging with these participatory institutional design processes and institutional experimentation, Chapter 6 then provides the conversation starters for democratic renewal and reform. And I'm deliberately framing it as conversational starters because I'm not offering a blueprint or anything like that for how democratic politics should be conducted. So we can see that what citizens want, and accordingly what radical proceduralists, at least from the drawing from the processes that I observed, have to ask for, are more and more immediate, intensified participatory opportunities. With regards to legislation, citizens propose to make the luxury of thinking things through available to everyone, to couple deliberative mini publics with referendums. That was a prominent suggestion in the German case. When it comes to constitutional provisions and the principles, the roots of the game, we can see that constitutional provisions and also constitutional review processes are usually in the hands of judicial elites. And here I propose that citizen juries can actually be equally well employed to put law on trial and to examine and review constitutional provisions. Lastly, democratic theorists and even proceduralists frequently propose to consider constitutional change as something that shall be mainly pursued by political and judicial elites. And here I propose to put a stronger emphasis on civil society-led reform initiatives that act beyond and against institutions, and to make participatory tools and democratic innovations available to social movements and also to civil society-led organizations such as the one in Germany that I studied, and the Icelandic Constitutional Initiative. All this being said, it is crucial to keep in mind that these are not finite solutions or blueprints for how to organize democratic politics, but that concrete proposals for institutional design and constitutional reform are always must always be the contingent result of citizen deliberation. And here I'm drawing from two exemplary cases in Western democracies. This also points us again to the limits of theory, to the limits of abstract theorizing, but also to the role that democratic theorists, political theorists, can take in democratic societies. And I want to conclude with this. So as uncomfortable, maybe restraining, and maybe, depending on the result, even scary as it may appear, the role of radical proceduralists in democratic societies, and I would say the role of political theorists, democratic theorists in democratic societies, is to start and facilitate open-ended conversations, not to deliver their conclusions. And with this, I'm very much looking forward to your comments and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dannica. Fantastic for the book and the presentation. We're going to move to Dr. Sonia Bussu and comments.
Great. So I want to start by congratulating Dannica on writing a fascinating book, which raises a lot of important and sometimes uncomfortable questions and provides insightful answers and takes some very courageous positions. But it is also a thoroughly enjoyable read, full of witty remarks and comments. You heard the excerpt about the cinema, and when I read that, I wrote a note to myself: never go to the cinema with Dannica and her friends. It sounds way too complicated. So there is a lot I like about the book, and most of my comments and questions are really aimed at understanding better your arguments and positions, which I'm quite sympathetic to. So firstly, the question underpinning the whole book is an important one. Are fair and inclusive procedures that respect the viewpoints of all affected individuals what truly matters? Or must we take into account the quality of the outcomes as well? And the book makes a strong case for radical proceduralism, whereby political legitimacy is solely dependent on fair and inclusive democratic procedures, and there is no political truth. And so Dannica embraces epistemic abstinence, and her book rejects accounts that base the legitimacy of democratic institutions on their potential to produce good or correct outcomes. And instead, she provides an alternative to an expertocratic vision of democracy, where the goal is not consensus, but rather harmonization. And so deliberation is not about finding the correct policies necessarily, but rather acquiring critical competencies and skills. And so at one point you write that participation, and I'm quoting you, requires not factual knowledge or expertise, but practice. And this really reminds me of Carol Pateman's understanding of democracy as developmental as well. So as a radical proceduralist, you believe that all democratic procedures, and not just policies, must be subject to citizens' deliberation and decision-making through an open, what you describe as an open-ended process based on participants' full autonomy. And full autonomy, following Drazek, you say, is realized through critical reflection upon citizens' own preferences, which relies on intersubjectivity or exchanges with citizens that have different views. And the process also has to be open-ended. So decisions and institutions must be reversible in case citizen needs or their preferences change. And then a large part of the book is actually a deconstruction of Rawls and Habermas' proceduralist arguments, which for different reasons don't fully meet the standards of radical proceduralism or actually, like Dannica's j'accuse against both Rawls and Habermas' bias in favor of Western institutions when discussing rationality potential. They fail to bridge the gap between theorizing and real-world institutions as well. But however, radical proceduralism entails equal and fully autonomous citizens, which also imply, to me, extra procedural values. So in fact, the same circular relationship that you highlight in Habermas' work between rights and democratic procedures applies here as well. And therefore, you need to assume certain values outside the actual procedure to realize radical proceduralism. So I think in chapter 5, you engage with some of the possibly frightening implications of radical proceduralism, and you entertain some scenarios whereby under radical proceduralism, citizens of a democracy may use democratic procedures to abolish democracy altogether or to restrict rights. So perhaps some reflection on these scenarios and how you deal with them can help clarify this point on whether radical proceduralism can genuinely prescind from certain progressive values. So your discursive interpretation of radical proceduralism makes an empirical assumption about individuals' ability and motivations to engage in communicative action. And you critique Habermas as no real-world political process is capable to fully realize his ideal of a domination-free, rational, and consensus-oriented discourse. But the same might apply here in the context of society that are profoundly unequal, with people that actually have different abilities, opportunities, and motivations to engage because of socioeconomic inequality or different cultural capital. So does the aim to be inclusive risk becoming just an utopian here as well? So by the same token, because of all power imbalances within our societies, could radical proceduralism actually risk empowering less inclusive but more visible views in a context where there are no longer extra procedural values and norms to abide to? And see, in a way, this also made me think of Popper's paradox of tolerance. So my third point is in the book, you present what you call participatory institutional design that builds on dialogues led with and among democratic citizens, where participants' input should be used to develop, as you say, a constructive theoretical notion of democratic legitimacy for a particular citizenry. And you propose, as you mentioned in your presentation, these concrete conversation starters that suggest that, and I'm quoting you again, institutional devices which can provide facilitating structures for radical proceduralist democracy. And here as well, so you give a nod to some really interesting idea of handing over the task of constitutional reviews to citizen juries to put law on trial, as you say, and also strengthening civil society initiatives and movement to promote bottom-up constitutional reform. But you devote most of your argumentation about this conversation starter to mini publics and coupling of mini publics and referendums. And I wonder why you think this is a particular conducive space to bottom-up theorizing, as in a way many publics are based on a liberal understanding of rational communication, which might actually create or exacerbate exclusions. I like your systemic understanding of democracy and democratic decision-making that allows for a division of labor between different democratic spaces and citizens, which sort of links a lot to some of the work I'm doing on participatory system. But the challenge is connecting all these different spaces, and many publics these days are grabbing all the attention in a way. And then my last point is just a provocative question that links to your last slide as well. So you identify 4 types of actor within this participatory institutional design: citizens who serve as representatives of their own beliefs and context experts, scientific experts or professional who have specialized knowledge, then democratic practitioner who can mediate the process from, as you say, an operative point of view, and lastly, radical proceduralist, political theorist. And as you said before, they are left with the task to start and facilitate open-ended conversation rather than delivering conclusion. And I wonder if you can elaborate a bit on what his role entails, and whether the citizen theorists or radical proceduralists might actually make political theorists entirely redundant. So I think I'll leave it here, and then so we can have more time for other comments, and then open to the audience. But I also want to thank you again for involving me in this, and I really enjoyed reading the book, and I feel I learned a lot as well, so thanks.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Really fantastic comments, extremely interesting. Professor John Parkinson, I think, already joined us. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Marta, and thanks very much for the invitation. I must apologize. My internet provider has given me a new modem, and they decided that 3:45 would be a really great time to switch the old one off. So I'm now working through my phone. So apologies if things break up. I'll switch video off, and we'll try and we'll muddle along somehow. So let me preface my comments by partly what I want to say is what Sonia just said. There we go. But it's great. I think we're on the same page here. But part that's a good thing in some ways, because I think it shows that how clear the argumentation is in this, how clear Dannica sets out her case and the grounds of that case. So it's, you're led in an intricate but very clear pathway, and it's a pleasure to encounter. It was one of those books as I went through that I kept on thinking, "Ha-ha, I've got her," and then turn over the page and damn, she thought about that. And every time it was great as a result. It's just one of those books where you get into the pleasure of it because you see a mind at work who's really thinking through things. So it was, and I commend it to everybody here. Of course, it wouldn't be one of these things without saying, of course, there's things wrong. So I'm going to set out what some disagreement. But I'm kind of going to stick a little bit, to some specific claims that are made in the book, rather than sort of going too far off piste here. And I particularly want to just have a look at the implications of a couple of the touchstones. So in when the radical proceduralist vision is set out, you set out these 4 touchstones: the quality of political results, the legal and constitutional provisions, the equality and expertise touchstone, and competences and inclusions. And these are the things that you think that a radical proceduralist view should avoid. I want to quote 2 of them. So just let me say a little bit about number 1. So it talks about avoiding procedure-independent notions of correctness or validity. Although earlier in the discussion and in your presentation today, you talk about, you tie that to an account of pluralism and diversity within the demos, within the citizenry, a diversity of positions and so forth. And then when it comes to, so it's not just about procedure independence, it's procedure independence relative to facts of diversity, facts of plurality. Yeah. And then Rp3, Equality and Expertise, you say radical proceduralism must refrain from determining persons or groups thereof that, based on their alleged privileged access to political truths, are justified in exercising political power. But that to me puts the issue from one direction, but there's another direction to look at it. And that is, what if there are people with particular claims, particular experiences that are not the power wielders, but the ones on the receiving end of power, the ones who are in a subordinate position, the oppressed and dispossessed. So I was imagining, for example, I've been doing some work on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander politics in Australia. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are 3.5% of the population, overwhelmed by 96.5% of the population descended from settlers. The state is almost entirely a settler state. And they say, on a wide variety of issues, this is our land, you stole it. This is our place where we practice our culture. We have been carrying this for 65,000 years. Expletive deleted, off. Now, in that situation, those people say the demand to listen, the demand to enter into a fair dialogue with others on an individual basis is itself oppressive. There's no duty on me to listen to this vast, overwhelming settler state. The duty is the other way around. Not only do they say that, but they say that their positions are not based on weighing of values or incommensurability or plurality. They say that their views are based on experience, on lived experience, on what it's like to be living in a black body in a settler colonial state that was taken from them, in a land that was taken from them. So it's not for them a matter of a difference between substance and procedure. It is absolutely about substance. And yet it seems to me that the framework here wants to tell those people that they're not allowed to bring that substance to the table. Indeed, they're not allowed to, you might say, and some people do, that procedures are the substance, that this boundary between procedure and substance is an analytic boundary and only an analytic boundary. And actually, a lot of what people are arguing about is how we do things here. So the very thing you want to argue about is it becomes a symbol. It's an identity marker. It's something valuable, and you can't just reduce it to a procedure in some kind of Habermasian or Rawlsian or radical proceduralist view. Now, I think that there's a second step I want to take, which is that if that's true, then knowledge is not just plural, but it's constructed in groups. It's constructed in groups from experiences of the world. And if that's true, then then knowledge is not unsettled in the way you portray it. Knowledge about what to do and how to do things is not unsettled. It's clumped, it's groupy, it's related to experience. Okay. And if that's the case, then in some ways we come back to a bunch of understandings of democracy which are about how do we differently situated, differently identifying groups of others share this place, share this space, share these resources, get along together. How do we muddle along together? Yeah. But that involves, don't steal my land, don't kill my kids, control your cops, give us fair housing, don't build pipelines across our ancestors' lands, don't destroy our sacred sites, don't tear down our symbols, don't set fire to them, don't burn our, etc., etc., etc. Right? These are substantive claims, not procedural ones. And if that's true, then probably what we want is something more along the lines of representation as relationship from someone like Iris Marion Young. We might want, you mentioned Young, but she's got a whole set of sort of ideas around how you navigate this stuff, which doesn't just collapse into role assignment along the lines of Tom Cristiano. It's a much more pluralist thing, right? Where you might follow someone like Sailor Ben-Habib, who talks about the claims of culture and how you weigh those and treat those. Yeah, and you might even bring in a little bit of Estlund. I think he's more subtle than you. I think you treat Estlund a little unfairly. He's got some views about the nature of what he calls political truth is not this kind of objectivist thing that sometimes gets portrayed. So look, that's the big challenge, right? Is this a world of liberal individuals all puzzling away together, or is this a world of groups with situated experience and difference and power relations? And if it's the latter, what does that do? But look, if you're already a radical proceduralist and you read this book, then this gives you reasons to go all the way, to go really deep, to really consider how far proceduralism goes. It really, challenges you to extend and think about your commitments here. If you're not yet convinced, if you're not already a radical proceduralist, this gives you damn good reasons to become one, right? It really takes you through the process. But if you're not a radical proceduralist or you're not convinced by it, this gives you a very clear set of arguments. It gives you reasons to grab hold of that allow you to rethink your own position. And even that is a fantastically valuable thing. So I commend it heartily, and thank you, Dannica.
Thank you so much, John. Really thought-provoking in a good way comments. I actually would like to gather one or two more questions before actually giving back the floor to Dannica. So I have a question already. Thank you so much from Jonathan Clark. Jonathan, would you like to ask this question, or would you? Okay, you unmuted.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much, everybody, for this fascinating discussion, and thank you to Dannica Fleuß for this amazing presentation. I was curious if you, in the book, which I've ordered but haven't read yet, if you go into this or if you have thoughts on how do we deal with the boundary problem of like who is included in the procedure to determine who should be included in the procedure? Like who are the people you even start to ask about these things? How do you decide where to focus that?
Thank you. Dannica, would you like to this is the comments have been very substantive, so I think it's a lot to take up. Please feel free to choose what sort of aspects you would like to comment on, and I very much encourage other questions in the meantime.
Okay. Thank you so much, first of all, for all these substantive comments, and also for giving me your insights from reading the book, and it feels great to discuss all this now with you. I would like to briefly first react to Jonathan's question, because it was a rather short question compared to the long comments that John and Sonia prepared. Am I dealing with or addressing the boundary problem in the book? So whom are we actually asking when we're asking citizens to determine political norms, principles, or institutions. Yes, I'm dealing with that in this outline of radical proceduralist ideals and the discursive approach in chapter 5. I don't have like, it's probably not surprising, or maybe it's disappointing, but it's probably not surprising. I don't have like a final solution to the boundary problem. So I haven't met anyone who has so far. But what I'm saying there is basically, okay, we start in democratic citizenry from the groups that we, for example, when we examine the German or the Icelandic process that come together that we have. And then who belongs to that community and who should be asked is also subject to deliberation, contestation among the people, and is not supposed to be determined either by factors like citizen status or by other of these variables that political philosophers usually set out. I'm aware that I'm thereby not solving the boundary problem, but it's one of those issues where I feel, and I'm going to react to the statements from John and Sonia in that regard, where I feel it's this radical proceduralist dilemma. On the one hand, we don't want to exclude people. So what I'm explicitly saying is we should include all who are affected, but obviously determining who is affected and who's not, or who's substantively affected poses another kind of question. I'm more or less handing that over to citizens, but I would like to come back to that when I'm addressing Sonia's comments about the different scenarios and so on, because then I guess this my approach to the problem might become clearer, although it's not like a finite solution to the issue at the end of the day. So I made notes while you were talking and giving me your comments, and I'm going to do my best to answer the core points. So Sonia started out by arguing that in my approach to political ideals, I'm presupposing an account of full autonomy, so a specific understanding of political autonomy or of citizens' autonomy that is itself a normative understanding or normatively laden understanding. For me, that's I'm not rejecting that. For me, that's not. I'm open about that in the book, and I'm very transparent about the fact that with this specific understanding of autonomy that I'm presupposing here, I'm making a normative assumption, and that I'm transparent about that, and that we don't have to make that assumption, that we cannot presuppose another understanding of autonomy. The understanding of autonomy that I'm presupposing here then very much compared to rather liberal accounts of autonomy aims at critical self-reflection and also this emancipatory process of reflecting on how people have developed their preferences, perspectives, and understandings of politics and the world. And now you asked me if I'm thereby I'm doing the same thing, or if I have a liberal bias, basically, if I'm ending in the same dilemma as Habermas when I'm doing that. Well, two responses to that. First, I think I'm more transparent about the fact that the understanding of autonomy that I'm presupposing here is nothing that I derive from other worldly principles or from a historical reconstruction of communicative action or something like that, but that it's something that I'm doing here and that I'm doing deliberately, you can also do something else. Secondly, I think the account of full autonomy that very much draws also from John Dryzek's understanding of full autonomy that I'm outlining there may align with certain aspects that Habermas commits to in his early writing and in the theory of communicative action. But at the end of the day, I would argue that it has much more critical potential and doesn't exactly end up with these with promoting these liberal democratic values and institutions that Habermas things we should be committed to at the end of the day. Then you said that on making empirical assumptions about individuals' abilities or capabilities, and I think the comment that you made there partially also overlaps with what John said. Because you I think rightly argue that in unequal societies, and most of the time we have to deal with societies where there are grave inequalities. This may cause problems or may not apply, and could actually empower the wrong people at the end of the day, because leaving all these matters open, letting everyone engage in processes that determine political norms and institutions could actually, at the end of the day, disadvantage those who not already have a certain educational background or a certain economic background or a certain class or ethnic background and so on. We can see this bias, I think, and that's something that's also discussed in the empirical literature a lot, also in certain, like in many mini-publics and so on. So who's actually showing up in the mini-publics or participatory processes at the end? Usually we have a bias in these processes. Nevertheless, I would say that radical proceduralist, the radical proceduralist account that I'm outlining here is not empowering the wrong people for two reasons. The first reason would be that from my perspective, political institutions and participatory institutional design also can and often has had a positive impact on political, on economic structures or on political economy, on progressive politics that empower the right people from your perspective or point of view. On the other hand, and now we're getting into like these terminological issues with right and wrong again, I think my main point here, and the main point why I don't want to take a specific stance with regards to political economy also at this point, is that I think only by avoiding the notion of political truth, at least as a political theorist, and in this role as a political theorist, I'm avoiding the paternalism that may actually be useful to the people who already are in power. And I have no good reasons to give an account of political truth, either on a philosophical basis or based on any other arguments that I outlined. So with regards to your criticism of my conversation starters, one very brief remark. You said, okay, when you're referring to concrete conversation starters, you're most of the time referring to deliberative mini publics, and by this you could actually, at the end of the day, promote liberal ideas of deliberation or communication again. And so why do you think that mini publics are the most conducive spaces for this collaborative democratic theorizing, or for engaging citizens in rewriting constitutions or something like that? It's true that I'm referring a lot to mini public citizen assemblies and so on. One remark that I would like to make here is that in these accounts, I presuppose a rather broad understanding of deliberation. So I wouldn't say, okay, only specific forms of communication are permitted in these communicative forums for citizen exchanges about norms and institutions. They must deliberate in terms of giving deductively valid arguments and reasons, and solely on these accounts. So that's not my claim. And so maybe mini public could here be understood in a broader sense than you presuppose that in your comment. Your last provocative comment, and then I'm going to come to John's remarks. When I'm arguing for the fact that political theorists should not deliver the conclusions for what should be done in political terms or in democratic societies, when I'm arguing for all this theoretical restraint, am I then at the end of the day abolishing myself or abolishing my own role as a political theorist? Do political theorists have any role at all in democratic societies? I think we, and this we is always a bit of a problematic notion, we can and have, or can have a productive role in democratic societies. It's not the role of the philosopher king for obvious reasons, so we cannot offer blueprints for how to design democratic societies. It's, from my perspective, also not the role of the interpreter of our democratic institution or our political culture. So something that Rawls very much tries to do, at least in his later work. For me, that's too much. I don't see any point why I should be competent in interpreting my or our community's political democratic culture. What I'm outlining in the 5th chapter at the end of the day is an understanding of a specific competence that I think political theorists can have due to their training and their profession. And that's this critical capacity or the skill to exercise criticism. I mean, we're trained in that, we're doing that right now with each other. That's not a role that usually allows you to outline what other people should do, but it might give you the competence to act as a political or as a public intellectual, in Habermas's terms, to engage in democratic discourses and to criticize existing distorted communication, symbolic communication, ideological discourses. And I think this can also be a quite productive role, although it's at least at the first surface level, in the first instance, like a negative thing that we're doing. So we're criticizing as something that is not valid or that doesn't hold up at the end of the day. I'm gonna get to John's comments right now. So first of all, this was one thing that you said right in the beginning, and where I just wanted to be a bit clearer about what I meant. I'm not sure if I communicated that clearly enough before. You said that I'm arguing in my first touchstone, so RP1, the radical proceduralist touchstone RP1, that there should be no standards of quality or validity that are procedure independent, particularly vis-a-vis the pluralism and diversity in democratic societies. And for the claim that there is no such thing as political truth, and I'm not sure how far we will get with our Estland debate today, but with regards to the claim that there is no such thing as political truth, for me it is important to highlight that with pluralism and diversity here, I mean like a combination of different things when it comes to political issues. So political questions, questions about what should be done in political terms, for example, with regards to abortion legislation or so, always are highly complex, and so they involve matters of values, they involve factual questions, and they will involve competing interests and preferences of groups or individuals. And the crucial claim that I'm making here is, well, on the one hand, we have pluralism and diversity when it comes to interests and preferences in contemporary democratic societies, but it's more than that. So even like at the level of values, we have perennial philosophical disputes about all these questions that have been ongoing for, I don't know how many decades or ages or centuries. And also when it comes to these most factual questions, we often don't have a finite answer to the relevant empirical questions at stake. So on all levels, when it comes to the details of applying like apparently obvious things or apparently obvious moral principles about what is just, right, or correct to such concrete political questions and issues, I think it becomes rather hard to actually formulate anything that holds up. And that's my main criticism or that's why I'm arguing again vis-a-vis pluralism and diversity at all these levels, philosophically and politically. We cannot claim that there's any such thing as political truth with regards to these issues. And then you went into, I think that's what you spent most of your constructive criticism on. You spent a lot of time on the colonial challenge. And that also overlaps a bit with one comment that Sonia made. So are radical proceduralists at the end of the day empowering the people that are already in power by not prescribing, for example, substantive notions for how just societies economically, racially, and so on should look like. First of all, I admit that it's a problem when we apply to political economy anyway. So the question here is always, how can we get from current societies with unequal conditions to more equal societies, and how can this process be conducted? I'm not really answering that question in the book, and I admit that. Nevertheless, the colonial challenge, and you put it like, why should people who stole my country be treated equally and have an equal say in politics, is I think a quite crucial and a special one again. So I'm arguing explicitly that radical proceduralists should not determine, and that's the third touchstone, should not determine groups or people who wield power based on their proclaimed expertise or knowledge or status, epistemic status as well. And I think when we address the colonial challenge or the post-colonial challenge, depending on what part of the world you look at, from this perspective, we can also make the reverse argument. So I see my argumentation rather as a tool for the people to address post-colonial paternalism and appeals to epistemic superiority that have often been raised by Western theorists and regimes that now, for example, in Africa, that's a context that I'm more familiar with, implement basically Western political institutions as the right solution to how democratic politics should be conducted. So what I'm saying in my book is there is no such thing as political truth. And accordingly, neither political theorists, neither the canonical political theorists, nor other epistemic, judicial, or political elites can tell you what to do. All people can and should exercise their critical capacities. So from that perspective, we can also turn the argument around. And in my discussions of my anti-paternalism and this specific notion, we cannot, as political theorists, tell you what to do. At the University of Nairobi, for example, people were very fond of this notion and saw it more as an empowering tool to counteract people who proclaim that they are something like an epistemic elite. Yeah, so I think it's a question of how we use this rejection of epistemic authority. We could, on the one hand, say, okay, as political theorists, we then cannot make substantive claims, for example, about how certain political, economic issues should be regulated. And you're certainly right to point out that there are unequal starting positions and so on, and that people, Aboriginal communities, and so on, make substantive claims. And there I'm getting to my second point, and I think that's a quite crucial point. The radical proceduralism as a notion that says, okay, there is no such thing as political truth at all, is something like a second order notion. And I'm not saying, and I also wouldn't say that I myself, as a democratic citizen, am a radical proceduralist. I have strong convictions, and I'm very good at arguing for them or against other people about my strong convictions. So I'm not telling people, and that's, I think, a very crucial point, don't have any normative convictions about substantive issues, don't fight for them, don't engage in political struggles. I'm arguing that we cannot claim with philosophical authority or in the role as a philosopher or as a theorist in the superior epistemic role that we know what to do, or that we can derive that from any philosophical theoretical notions, a rational reconstruction of consciousness or whatever. But I'm not telling people that they shouldn't fight for what they think is in their interest, is right for their groups, or to not be partisan. And I think this differentiation of roles that we, and now again the problematic we, that we can take depending on the situation we engage in, depending on the role that we adopt, is quite crucial to my understanding of radical proceduralism, because from my perspective, we're then engaging in different epistemic contexts. As a philosopher, I cannot tell you what to do. As a citizen, I have super strong convictions, and maybe as a political theorist who also engages with empirical research and makes certain or knows certain things, thinks that she knows certain things about how politics can work in a different context. I can maybe say a bit more, or at least when I'm being transparent about my own assumptions and preconditions and so on, give some more specific recommendations. But I would always use radical proceduralism and the anti-paternalistic notion embedded there as an empowering tool, and as a tool that rather encourages different groups to fight for what they think is right against universalistic proposals that come from either Western political theorists or political elites or judicial elites.
Thank you so much, Dannica. Very substantive response to a lot of questions. I would like to encourage any further questions from the floor. So please, this is the time. We actually already have a question from 16 to who I'm going to pass on to ask a question.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you a lot, Dannica, for this great presentation and for the book. I'm really looking forward to reading it. I'm wondering, so I totally agree with you on the aspect of democratic theorizing, and I've been lucky enough to encounter that during my fieldwork. And I was wondering, so how did you encounter and how did you think after that in your fieldwork the question of how to decide on how to decide? So I had that, for example, in assembly. It was like, okay, how do we directly democratically decide how we are going to decide? Because that first decision is not previously legitimate by any other decision. So I just was wondering how would you think about this in a radical proceduralist way?
Thank you so much. Dannica, do you want me, because we don't have any other questions, but actually I had one more question, so you can respond to both if you don't mind. So I know that when you're writing the book, the COVID just happened. When you're finishing the book, the COVID just happened. But you kind of overlap a little bit with finishing the book with the pandemic and all those discussions. Yeah, what's the role of publics? What's the role of experts? To be honest, I just wanted to ask you maybe pressure, not maybe pressure, invite you, I think that's a good way to put it, to maybe reflect a little bit more on how do you think your accounts, radical proceduralism, what sort of relevance it has for issues of pandemic and consequences for designing certain responses to catastrophes or emergencies. The way kind of I thought about, like, you very much strongly argue that there is no political truth, and somebody could argue that issues of epidemics, issues of emergency, of health emergency are kind of beyond the political. But then I'm wondering whether they really are, because a lot of those questions involve very much political issues and political aspects. So yeah, that would be my question. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for these great questions. So first of all, with regards to 16's question about how I conducted my fieldwork, I haven't conducted a fieldwork strictly speaking. I have interviewed people who have been involved in these participatory institutional design processes, but I haven't set up any mini publics or something like that myself. What I am outlining in the book is, in the sixth chapter, a rather broad framework of what participatory institutional design can mean from my perspective. So, for example, what agents can or should be involved, what forms of communication would be appropriate from my perspective, what decision mechanisms can be used, and so on. And this account of participatory institutional design actually leaves many of these issues open and gives you also probably more negative things about things that you should avoid. So I'm saying, for example, okay, we should impose rigid standards for highly rational communication on citizens when we gather them together or when we mediate these processes, we shouldn't have a rigid consensus requirement when it comes to the decision-making procedure and so on in these mini publics. I think there are two ways to respond to this question. The first question is, I think what would be the best scenario for democratic theorizing and for democratizing democratic theorizing would be to collaborate or investigate institutional reform processes that have actually been initiated bottom up, so by citizens themselves. And then they obviously need to set some rules for that, and maybe we as political theorists can sort of advise or mediate these processes, but I would very much promote these, not a role of political theorists to then set up a mini public to study it, but to also study bottom up evolving civil society led institutional reform processes. The other way around, and I'm exploring that, or I hope to explore that quite soon in the upcoming project, would be the question, okay, and what happens when you have to create these spaces deliberately? And here, what I'm currently thinking about, but I haven't conducted it so far, is very much a collaborative approach with the respective communities in diverse cultural contexts, where we first sit down together to actually discuss the rules of the game and all these questions that you just rightly addressed. So what are the decision mechanisms, who should be included, and so on. And obviously with this, you're not solving the highly philosophical issues at the end of the day or at the principle level, such as the boundary problem or something like that. But when it comes to doing this field work and to engaging as a mediator, as a facilitator of these processes, I think we should be honest about the fact that we collaborate with citizens and sort of navigate, or at least try to navigate the hierarchies that may result from the point of departure and situation. So Marta, what's the role of the public and of experts, and what would radical proceduralists say to situations of emergency, and particularly in the pandemic? Well, I think, first of all, I think most issues, or many issues, okay, there are some potentially hard facts. So obviously there's still like a scientific debate, and also the debate about the insecurity of provisional empirical findings was sort of interesting, I think, to observe over the past months. But let's say there are some hard facts that the empirical facts about the fact that there is something like COVID, and well, we now also have something like a vaccine. Okay, so let's presuppose that. I nevertheless would never say that this is something that is beyond the political or anything like that. I think it involves so many political issues at so many levels. And then it becomes interesting because there are hard facts, but at the end of the day, I would say there are no political truths. Nonetheless, there are no political truths in the sense outlined in the beginning, because questions such as how should we, for example, what shops are allowed to open first? I think that's not a question where there's a right or wrong answer, either from a moral philosophy perspective or from any other perspective. That will always be a matter of competing interests, value disputes, and probably also some disputed empirical facts about what works best or what will work best for a society. And apart from that, well, it's not beyond the political to the extent that it's, well, when we have a look at how vaccines, for example, are distributed in the global south and in the global north, I think that's anything but not political from my perspective. And it was, yeah, it was quite interesting for me to be in Africa during pandemic times and to also see how political discourses have been led there. What would a radical proceduralist say more specifically? Well, there is no such thing as a right or the one right or just solution to these disputed issues, like how should we distribute vaccines or something like that. But exercising our critical capacities and exercising maybe also, well, the tools provided by political philosophy, the argumentative tools, and observing discourses, I think we could nevertheless criticize the way these discourses have been led in different parts of the world. And one thing would be to criticize, well, more right-wing conspiracy theorists. There could be a role as a public intellectual to do that. But I also think that just observing how unequal the patterns of discourses have been in the global south and in the global north, we can identify a lot of post-colonial heritage and so on in the way these discourses have been led in different parts of the world and how disconnected they have been. So here I'm sort of not acting as a radical proceduralist philosopher. That would be a second order notion. There's no right or wrong solution to these issues. But I think when we take this notion of theoretical restraint, but also the notion of what exercising critical capacities and skills means as a point of departure, we can nevertheless criticize many discourses that are really not beyond the political, although there may be no political truth to these matters, strictly speaking.
Thank you so much, Dannica. On this note, I think we are going to finish, already run out 5 minutes. I'm going to use this final words to thank you so much, Dannica, for launching the book. Fascinating book. Sonia, John, thank you for your fantastic, very detailed comments. Thank you for the audience for coming and for your questions. The video will be available online on the PSA PDD website, so please do check out if you want to catch up with some of the arguments. And I hope to see you on the future events organized by the specialist group. Thank you so much, and congratulations again, Dannica.
Thank you so much.